Hello there, it's Christine Marie Mason, your host for the Rose Woman Pod. Today we're talking with Stephen Taylor, who's written a book on spiritual awakening when trauma leads to transformation. He has made a study of people who, whether it's through warfare, imprisonment, grief, addiction, or other things, have, instead of collapsing in the face of trauma and challenge, have had a catalytic moment into profound awakening, who have shifted their life in a permanent way. Some people might call that grace or enlightenment, but he says it happens more often than we think, and I find his work profoundly hopeful. If you are someone who's had a spiritual experience that you struggle to explain, or you've known someone who's bottomed out and suddenly become radiant from within, or you yourself are struggling and see no light at the end of the tunnel, let's talk with Steve and see what he has to share. I'd also love to hear your stories. If you have been in the middle of something that was dark and scary, and suddenly you felt irradiated, filled with light, and like nothing could disturb your peace, I'd love to hear about that. You can message me at the.rose.woman on Instagram. What does it look like to tap into the incredible reserves of power that are inside of us? Let's hear about it. Welcome, Steve.
In addition to writing this most recent book, you've got all of these other books. You're a professor, you're a householder, speaking and teaching. And I was wondering, before we got into the meat of this book, if you could talk a little bit about your personal journey. How did you become interested in spirituality and healing?
It was natural to me certainly from the age of 16, 17. At that age, I began to have spiritual experiences, although I didn't understand them at the time. But I would have, experiences of feeling very connected to my surroundings, feeling a sense of oneness with nature, feeling a sense of profound inner well-being. And it just seemed to be inside me. I don't know where it came from. It didn't come from my environment, because my environment was very non-spiritual, non-religious. So I had no influences in that direction. It just took me a while to understand it. It took me maybe 5 or 6 years until I was in my early 20s. That's when I began to realize I wasn't actually crazy. I was I wasn't alone in my craziness, maybe I could say.
That's interesting that you say that, because I read this amazing book that studied spiritual experiences, and most people have them, as you said, in nature. They have moments of glorious connectivity, but they don't tell anyone because they don't want them to think they're crazy. So it's right in line with broader research on that. So the spiritual experience as a perception of being very connected and present, and sort of this lightness or spaciousness is what I often hear. What's the difference between that and an awakening?
Well, they're very similar, but it's the same basic characteristics, but spiritual experiences are usually by definition temporary. They sometimes last for a few seconds, maybe a few minutes, maybe a few hours, maybe even a few days if you're lucky. But they fade away again, and there's a return to normal consciousness. But spiritual awakening is a long-term, ongoing thing. It can be a gradual, long-term process, or it can happen in a sudden moment of transformation. It shifts people into a permanent state of wakefulness.
And what are some of the qualities of that state?
Well, I mentioned connection already. That's one of the primary things. You feel a sense of connection to nature. You feel a sense of connection to other people. You feel a sense of connection to something deeper inside yourself. You feel a sense of connection to the whole universe. You're no longer a separate entity living inside your mental space. You're part of the world, part of other people. So that's one of the main characteristics. And people tend to become more altruistic, more compassionate, less materialistic. They become more interested in contributing to the world rather than accumulating things, rather than accumulating money or power or success. And everything becomes much more real. The world around us becomes more vivid, more beautiful, more interesting. And there's a sense of gratitude as well, a sense of appreciation for the simple things in life, for for the simple fact of being alive itself, for people, for eating, drinking, walking, seeing, all of these things.
I know people who try to cultivate those experiences through spiritual practice. Let me see if I can clarify. Like, as you move from the experience to the awakening, if someone has an experience and then they're supported by practices or a community of others who share these sort of values, can you engineer the awakening?
Definitely, yeah. It doesn't always work, but if you follow spiritual practices or a spiritual path, then it will lead you to awakening, as a gradual process. That's a great thing about spiritual paths, that they've been laid down for thousands of years in some cases, like yoga, Buddhism, Taoism, the Kabbalah, the Sufi path, and so on. So that tried and tested paths of spiritual awakening. So if you want, you can ally yourself to one particular path, and it will lead you to awakening. But I think a lot of people, they don't feel so comfortable, narrowing themselves to one particular path. So a lot of people develop a more kind of eclectic path of awakening, maybe including meditation, altruism, contact with nature. All of these things, all of those practices will lead you to awakening on a gradual, long-term basis.
Yeah, so if you're living sort of a normal life of a householder or whatever, and you're interested in having this lightness and this thing, it can be cultivated. I do think you're right about this dogmatic single path, although there is value in devoting yourself to a single methodology. But it has had so many abuses and ossifications in the power structures around those things that I think people are wary. But there's still a longing for that essential connection.
Yeah.
If you had a basically, what I would call the normal traumas of life, you've had heartbreak, you've had loss, you've had shocks of some sort. Often people are pulled into a spiritual path in response to those things. What draws people into a spiritual path? You had this gift as a child, but what draws most people in?
For many people, it can be a reaction to trauma. When people go through trauma, for example, bereavement is a good example. The surface of life doesn't satisfy them anymore. There's a hunger for meaning, the kind of, the simple materialistic pursuits of getting on in your career, becoming wealthier, more successful, and so on, just getting by with fun and entertainment. That's fine, but once you've been through a trauma, that doesn't seem enough. It seems shallow. So there's a hunger for something deeper. So people begin to explore spirituality, that they long for something more. I think basically it's a question of turning inwards. If you live externally, that can be satisfying for a while, but at some point you realize it's not enough, and you start to turn inwards. You start to explore the inner world, and you realize that the real source of happiness is not out there. It's within your own being. So that can be one of the main reasons. But I also think in a lot of people, it's, as it was with me, it's simply instinctive. I think there's an impulse to grow in people. Life is characterized by growth, physically and mentally and spiritually. So I think a lot of people just have this instinct. They want to grow. They want to expand. That's just part of evolution. The whole of evolution is based on expansion. And I think people are just following that impulse.
Yeah, there feels like an impulse, but I have a sense sometimes that it's a return to my birthright. That there was like socializing that was done that kind of isolated me or closed me off. And then I bliss is my birthright. Being connected to Steve is my birthright. Sometimes that feels like the most natural. This is the most natural thing I do every day. What's not natural? Sitting in front of a little metal box.
That's true.
For half the day.
Yeah, I think that's also true. I think we are conditioned to some extent out of spirituality. I think young children especially have a natural spirituality about them.
Yeah.
They can be narcissistic and egocentric, but they also have a natural presence, a natural joy, a natural connection.
Yeah.
And so on.
So when you started this particular book, you're looking at a lot of people who've had very traumatic experiences. What would be, deaths, NDEs, those kinds of things, cancer diagnoses, all that stuff that for many people really shuts them down, like contracts them and freezes them into an isolated spot. But that's not the story you're telling. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to ask this question of why some people thrive and how they thrive after a trauma while others contract.
It began with my research into spiritual experiences. For a long time, I was interested in collecting reports of spiritual experiences and finding out why spiritual experiences occurred. Why would people suddenly experience this sense of meaning and this sense of expansion and connection? I found that one of the major triggers of spiritual experiences was turmoil, psychological turmoil such as depression, despair, bereavement, and so on. People would suddenly shift from a state of despair into a spiritual experience, almost like sort of suddenly switching over into a polar opposite state. But I also found that some people who reported spiritual experiences after turmoil, they told me that they didn't return to their normal state of consciousness. They remained in this heightened state. And I began to do research on that in particular. I found that it was quite common for people who had, for example, been diagnosed with cancer, who had recovered from addiction. Even, I found lots of cases in prisoners, soldiers, many different types of trauma. It wasn't uncommon for people to, switch or shift into an ongoing state of heightened awareness. So there seemed to be a very strong connection between turmoil and spiritual awakening. And that was what led to the book. I basically collected many cases of transformation in the midst of intense psychological turmoil. And I chose some of the most sort of dramatic and interesting cases and presented them, in the book, along with a kind of analysis. And I also focused on what we can learn from these experiences, how we can apply them to our own spiritual development.
It's a little bit of a negative proof or whatever that's called in logic. Like you're focusing on the people who've had the long-term impact. What would you guess is the ratio of people who are having post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic freeze versus post-traumatic growth? And then sort of what portion of that are having the awakening experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. A really interesting question, because there's actually a lot of research on post-traumatic growth, which is a kind of a milder form of the kind of transformation I'm talking about. Post-traumatic growth is actually fairly common. Research suggests that between a third and half of people who go through trauma experience some post-traumatic growth in the long term. They become more appreciative, their relationships become stronger and deeper. They feel a new sense of inner strength and confidence. So it's by no means uncommon. But the kind of transformation I'm discussing is more radical, more dramatic. It's so dramatic that people often talk about feeling that they are a different person living in the same body. They feel like they are completely distinct from the people they used to be. And that's obviously not as common as post-traumatic growth. I don't have a specific figure, but I would guess it's something like just 1% of cases.
Yeah, but if it's possible, if it can happen to one person, it can happen to more.
Yeah.
The question is I love that you're doing the observation of who and why and how, because it's the common principles that create this deeper understanding of humans. The post-traumatic growth experience makes total sense to me. Like you learn more skills, you get confident in your resilience. It's almost like a survivor bias, So that makes total sense. Do you want to tell a story or two from the book?
Yeah, well, why don't I tell a story or two to illustrate the phenomenon? I think one of the most dramatic stories in the book, traumatic and dramatic. I never realized that trauma and drama are so closely linked, aren't they?
Oh, they are. Trauma and drama.
But anyway, one of the most dramatic and traumatic stories was a woman called Eve, who was an alcoholic for 29 years, very, very heavy drinker. From a very young age. And through the process of her addiction, like a lot of addicts, she slowly lost everything. She lost her friends, she lost contact with her family, she lost her job, she couldn't function anymore. She lost her possessions. She ended up homeless, living off the streets, shoplifting just to try to stay alive. And she was basically just feeding her addiction. And by that point, she wasn't actually gaining anything from alcohol. She was just drinking to control her withdrawal symptoms. She would start shaking and get hallucinations and feel this terrible paranoia and panic if she stopped drinking for any time. So she actually tried to stop drinking. She went to AA meetings and so on and had counseling, but nothing worked. So she decided that She, her situation was hopeless. She was living off the street. She felt emotionally and physically broken. So she decided to kill herself. And she actually attempted suicide. She threw herself in front of a coach that was traveling at 40 miles an hour. But luckily, the driver swerved, so she survived. But something happened to her in the process of attempting suicide. Something changed radically inside her. And the police were called. She expected to be arrested by the police because she caused this accident. But the policeman was actually very kind and said to her, what's happened to you? Can we do something to help you? Can I take you somewhere? There's somebody who can take you in. So the policeman took her to her parents' house, and she hadn't seen her parents for a long time. But her mother assumed that as she was an alcoholic, she'd have to give her a drink. So she gave Eve a glass of wine. But Eve couldn't drink the wine. She picked up the glass and just put it down again, picked up the glass, put it down again. She had no idea why, but she couldn't physically drink it. And then a doctor arrived and gave her some sedatives to control the withdrawal symptoms. And when she came to after the sedatives, she felt completely different somehow. She looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. She couldn't associate herself with a person in the mirror. And she realized that she didn't have any urge to drink, that after 29 years of being completely obsessed with drinking, the urge to drink had just strangely, mysteriously left her. And she felt this new sense of connection. She felt like the world had become more real, nature had become more beautiful. She felt a sense of empathy with other people that she'd never had before. And she felt this kind of inner well-being, which she'd never experienced before. So she knew that she'd changed radically, but didn't really understand how. And then she went to some AA meetings, and somebody said, you sound like you've had a spiritual awakening. Because they obviously know a lot about spiritual awakening in AA. And she thought, wow, what's that? Maybe I have. And then she began to understand what had happened. But she said that she felt a little bit, at the AA meetings, she met a lot of people who struggle to stay sober on a day-to-day basis. But she was just, she didn't have any struggle. The urge to drink had just left her mysteriously. So she felt that was very strange. But now it's been 10 years since her transformation, and she's remained in this ongoing state of well-being and connection, and also, freedom from the craving. So, it's a kind of an amazing story of moving from a state of complete desolation into a state of continual well-being.
I have so many responses to that. Like the first one is, of course, the bottoming out, that maybe that was it. And finally the shock or something moved through the body. But then the second thought I had was perhaps the policeman was giving her darshan. Maybe he had some enlightenment and empathy and care, and he touched her in some way or was present with her in a way that something happened. Or perhaps it was just simply grace. Like, I don't want to understand it solely as a biomechanical thing, for sure.
No.
But how do you understand it? How do you make sense of that?
Well, there were two things, really. One thing about it is the sudden disappearance of her addiction. And that's actually quite common. I met a lot of addicts, drug addicts, alcoholics who had the same experience. They'd bottom out, they'd lose everything and undergo transformation. And a part of that transformation was the sudden disappearance of craving. So I called it addiction release, because it's such a strange phenomenon. And it's quite a common phenomenon that there needs to be a term for it. But I think in order to understand addiction release, you need to understand the nature of the transformation that people go through. And it's essentially the death of the ego. People experience an ego death or ego dissolution. So when they go through a long period of intense loss and turmoil and trauma, the ego is slowly broken down. You can think of it in terms of psychological attachments, like all of the psychological attachments which sustain the ego. And by that, I mean things like hopes and ambitions, roles, status, success, achievements, and so on. All of these things are taken away. So the ego just collapses in the end, like a house when you take all the bricks away. It just collapses. But in the process of that collapsing, a new self emerges inside people, almost as if there's a latent higher self which is waiting to be born, a latent spiritually awakened self which is waiting to be born inside them. And it's a completely different self. It's a completely different identity. So when the ego dies, the addiction which the ego carried also dies, because the self which carried the addiction is no longer there. So the addiction is no longer there. And the new self which emerges, it doesn't have any addictions, it's completely clean and clear and fresh. Why should the addiction continue? The addiction just disappears in the death of the ego.
Do you have the sense that there's a new thing that comes alive in you, or that you're just uncovering what was already there, like this innocent core?
That's interesting, because I haven't really worked that one out. Because in some ways, it does seem as if people do take on a completely new identity. But at the same time, I can see I've had that experience myself, that when I've had spiritual experiences or undergone spiritual awakening, it feels like I'm connecting to something essential, which was always there. Something which is just covered over, like clouds covering the sun. Something which is covered over by concepts and thoughts and social conditioning. So I'm not really sure about that, because a lot of people do, despite what I've said, a lot of people do describe it in terms of at least feeling as if they are somebody completely different. It's almost as if they are taken over by a new identity. But at the same time, I think there is, in many people, a kind of authentic spiritual self which is occluded or covered up by the things I mentioned.
So here's a woman who is at the very bottom and has this spontaneous occurrence where she stops desiring to drink, the ego's dissolving around her, and now she's walking in the world and healing. And what are some of the other hallmarks of people who've had an awakening like that out of trauma?
Well, people often feel a tremendous sense of gratitude. It's as if they've woken up from a dream. I think that the dream is taking things for granted. I think human beings are kind of, we are primed to get used to things and to take things for granted, to forget the value of things. But when people undergo this transformation, they never forget the value of things. They are clearly aware of the preciousness of everything. So at the most basic level, they are aware of the preciousness of life itself. And even if in fact, another hallmark is that they often have a sense that there is some kind of afterlife. They often have a sense that this life is not all, but nevertheless, they feel that this life in itself is incredibly precious, because it's temporary, it's fragile, it's limited. They also feel a sense of purpose, and they want to spend as much time and energy as they can helping others and furthering their own development, expressing their creativity. So a veil falls away, and suddenly they're living in this precious, beautiful world. This world full of wonders and miracles. That's one of the main characteristics. You sound skeptical.
No, I'm actually just feeling the wonder of everything right this moment. I'm just using that as a prompt to breathe a little more deeply and look around me. And if you're listening and you want to do the same thing, it's an amazing thing that anything exists at all. And just, look, electric light and natural light and the way the wind is moving the curtains. Just look around you and have a moment of just taking it in. What a beautiful life.
Yeah, that's it. Taking it in is really important, because when people go through this transformation, they do take it in. They spend time taking it in. They pay attention to the phenomena around them, rather than being immersed in thoughts or plans or goals or dreams or memories.
Yeah, every major spiritual tradition, the embodiment was an important part. That you came into your body, whether you're, Buddha or Christ or you're Mary Magdalene or whatever enlightened being you want to tap into, a Hindu goddess, they're all embodied. So this idea that actually this is holy, this physical plane, and deeply experiencing it is I think that's the path of the tantrika. Taste everything. The only way God knows you, God knows what's possible, is by you tasting and touching everything as deeply as you can. I like that religion, actually.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and interestingly, that was another characteristic, or that is another characteristic of the shifters, as I call them. An appreciation for the body. And they take more care of the body. They're focused more on diet and health, and exercise, because they know that the body is precious and it's sacred, as you say. There's no division between body and spirit. The body is not spirit. The body is spirit.
So, do you believe that after studying people who are the shifters, after studying the shifters, or that there are ways that we can pull out what they've experienced and help people who are experiencing the same outer circumstances as trauma?
Definitely. Yeah. One aspect of it is that we can learn how to respond to trauma and turmoil when they arise in our lives, as they will from time to time. That's just part of life, part of our experiences, that trauma and turmoil will arise at some point. It's very clear that turmoil and trauma have transformational potential. So there are certain ways that we can approach them or respond to them in order to gain access to that potential. And in the book, I talk about the importance of acknowledgement and acceptance, particularly acceptance, which seems to be the kind of the alchemical, the alchemical quality which allows transformation to manifest itself. So a lot of people could actually identify a moment of acceptance when they stop resisting their predicament, when they opened themselves to their predicament, surrendered, if you like. And that was often the moment when transformation occurred. So it's really important to embrace the reality of your predicament, no matter how painful it may seem. Obviously, this takes some degree of courage as well. But it's really important to embrace the reality and to contemplate the reality and completely open yourself to it, even, with an attitude of oneness to it. And that will help to allow the transformation to take place.
Do you feel in psychological practice that people are able to be coached into that or held safely in a way that they can do it?
Both. Yeah, I think one of the great things about therapy or counseling is that it can encourage people to acknowledge and accept their predicaments. It creates a safe space, a supportive space where people can enter that mode of acknowledgement and acceptance. So yeah, I think they can be really beneficial, really helpful, because it does take courage. And human beings, we have what I call the avoidance impulse, which is entirely natural. Whenever we face pain, we try to avoid it, we try to escape it, to get away from it. But it's actually more beneficial for us to move towards pain and to accept it. But yeah, it's helpful if you have a therapist or a counselor who can help you to do that.
Some things seem very overwhelming. I was thinking about, you mentioned earlier the AAPs, and the model of psychology, for the most part, has been a one-on-one model, except you have this group therapy thing. And what seems to be emerging now is a collective healing process, we sit in, we witness each other on a peer basis and heal individually. And how important that support system is in being able to look at really difficult situations and not collapse or feel alone.
I think it's very important. Yeah, I think the group environment creates a more powerful, supportive space. I think, the more people there are, the more closely connected they are, the stronger the dynamic is, the stronger the supportive environment is. And that, that will help people to enter a mode of acknowledgement and acceptance, and also a mode of self-exploration as well, which is also important. It's also important to take the step of entering into your own being and facing and exploring your feelings. That's a really important part of the transformational process.
Do you believe that what happens in the individual is a mirror or a clue to what can happen at the societal level? Like right now, for example, many of us are very in a deep grief process around the climate and the inability to act. And one of the things that seems to be blocking that is acknowledgement of the depth of the problem and acceptance that things are changing. Can the same principles of individual awakening apply to cultural level change?
Definitely. I think it is happening. I think that's a very good example, because climate crisis, the climate emergency, is creating a lot of trauma. We are faced with the potential extinction of our species, and certainly the extinction of millions of other species, which is already happening. So there's a lot of trauma, and we're facing potential collective death, which is obviously incredibly traumatic. But there's a very close parallel with the transformation that individuals undergo when they face a diagnosis of cancer or when they face any intense trauma. It's a very similar process. I think on a collective level, we are undergoing a degree of awakening as a result of that. I think the trauma and the encounter with mortality is encouraging a collective awakening. I think that's why so many people are moving towards spirituality. I think that's why research shows that spiritual experiences are more common than they were 20 or 30 years ago. And I think that's why I find so many examples of people who undergo transformation through turmoil.
Maybe we see the ego death of Western civilization. Like it's how can you have an ego death which allows you to surrender to what is most difficult while retaining what is beautiful, and have both end in a way in one's life or in the culture.
Yeah, I think in some ways, after ego death, everything becomes more beautiful. Your awareness of reality becomes much more intense, and therefore the world becomes much more beautiful.
One of the big things that I'm feeling as you're speaking, I love the story of this woman. It's never too late. No matter where you are in your life, there's always the possibility of something happening that snaps you out of it. Transformation is available. Never give up. That's sort of a meta feeling tone.
Yeah, I agree. That's one of the things I've taken away from my research as well. It's been very inspiring. I did some research into Soviet gulags,
Mm-hmm.
and I found that there were a lot of cases of transformation in people who were living in appalling conditions in Stalin's gulags in the 1950s. People who were literally starving to death, who were living in sub-zero temperatures, who were suffering from diseases. A lot of people reported that they found this kind of soul force inside them when they were so ill and so hungry and so close to death. They found this kind of golden core of power inside them, which would keep them alive and keep them healthy and enable them to recover. And it's really quite remarkable. It's so remarkable that they would be in minus 30 degrees, but they wouldn't feel the cold. They would be starving to death, but they wouldn't feel hungry. They'd be able to survive on the most minuscule amounts of food. And it just makes you aware that there are incredible reserves of resilience inside human beings. We have a lot of powers that we're not normally aware of and which are harnessed in situations of extreme deprivation. It reminds me of, you heard of the concept of the siddhis in Indian yoga?
Yeah, yoga. Patanjali's Pada 3, I think.
That's right. It's the same thing. I mean, I think, when people are in situations of deprivation, they can gain access to the siddhis, these incredible powers, soul powers deep inside us, which we don't normally have access to. But, you can spontaneously get access to them in states of deprivation. So I think it's inspiring that there are these incredible reserves of resilience and power inside human beings.
I was reading about one of the rites of coming of age in certain high mountain tribes in Tibet is for a person to dip an ice cold blanket in a freezing lake and wrap it around themselves. And then they have to dry the blanket from generating intentional heat from the inside of themselves.
Wow.
And things like that, where, you've learned how to cultivate and control the body in these ways. But of course, it reminds me of, the classic Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, where he was able to document in such an eloquent way what you're talking about in the gulags. That you're in the middle of this situation, and the only thing that you can really control is your inner process. And his was more conscious. I mean, you're talking about it in a way where people are saying this is spontaneously happening, and everything's been distilled down to light and breath, and there's really nothing else except existence, and I'm fine, which is a very shocking idea for those of us addicted to creature comforts.
Yeah, it's a very strange idea that you can strip everything away and literally you have nothing left physically or mentally, but then you find this amazing spiritual power inside yourself. You find this amazing resilience and this amazing state of enlightenment within you. So I mean, I think that's why a lot of spiritual traditions have a tradition of asceticism, where people inflict pain and suffering on themselves. And I think basically they're trying to get access. They're trying to follow the same process in a conscious way. I mean, I'm not sure if it actually works when you do it consciously, but it's the same principle, I think.
I feel I have argument with that. I feel that's actually egoic. So there's a quality sometimes I feel in asceticism of an egoic pursuit. Like I'm so spiritual that I can take so much pain, or I can live so penitently, there's a weird denial. It's not the denial of sensory experience. It's the denigration of the body that bothers me in that. It's like I'm going to deny this body exists, and I'm going to punish it, and I'm going to pretend it has no needs. And like, you've been given this one beautiful life. Why think that that's not also holy? But you know what? There's 7.5 billion ways to live on Earth. So who am I to judge?
I think it gets hijacked by, I think in certain traditions like Christianity, there's a kind of a duality between the flesh and the spirit. And I think that can be taken too far into sort of denying and punishing the body because the body is not spirit. But I think it's a false idea. And as we said earlier, I think the body is a manifestation of spirit. It's not separate to spirit.
I was recalling a time for about 7 years. I went into the prisons in Northern California doing a transformational justice program on guiding rage into power. And the first time that I went in, I was very shocked to find what you've been talking about on people who are in extreme conditions, that there have been people who are in there with life eligible inmates who were bodhisattva. Their lives had become so distilled down to routines and simple activities, and they had so much time to reflect on what had happened and what they'd done, or what they'd been part of in the system that had led to a certain occurrence, and they were radiant.
No, yeah, that's interesting, because I mean, in my book, I had to spend 2 chapters discussing prisoners who undergone awakening because I found so many examples. It was a really strangely common phenomenon, as you said. I spoke to people, quite a few prisoners who'd undergone the experience of awakening, and I think it's to do with letting go. When you're in prison, you have to let go of everything, because everything which gives you an identity is actually outside the prison walls, on the other side of the prison walls. Your possessions, your role, your relationships, even. So you have to let go of everything, which is why one of the reasons why prison is a painful experience for many people, because it is painful to let go. But in the process of letting go, you can uncover something deeper. You can uncover your authentic spiritual self, or a new spiritual self can be born inside you. I think the other thing is that in prison, you have this environment where it's so turbulent outside you that you have to go inside to find any peace or happiness. So a lot of prisoners, they go inside themselves for the first time in their lives. They begin to explore their inner being for the first time, and they realize that there is this whole new inner world which they were never aware of before. And that's that is a revelation for many people.
Yeah, what you're saying echoes very true. The men, I was primarily working in a men's facility, would say, in my non-prison life, I never had a moment where I could rest to myself. That, you had to be vigilant all the time for imminent harm. And that at least here, when I'm in my cell, I can stand down for a minute, which interesting. I never thought of that. I had never thought of that before going in. I'm feeling the desire just to tell people to give a space in the interview, to invite people to feel what it would be like to just notice what you're gripping in your own life. Like, what identity, what relationship, what aspect of your constructed self are you really holding on to tightly? And just to feel that gripping and imagine it softening a little bit, just like a little release or surrender, and what it would feel like to not have expectations, to not think you were going to collapse if that thing disappeared. And even that little bit of softening, it feels different in the body, doesn't it?
So this thing, you don't have to bottom out to soften and surrender. It's available in micro steps every day. I love your book. I hope everybody reads it, because if you've got anyone in your life who's really at the bottom, or even if you personally have fears of bottoming out someday, know that there are other options, and be inspired by these stories and by the extraordinary research that Steve has done. Is there anything you'd like to add or make sure that people know before we close?
Continuing on the theme of what you were just saying, I think people should be aware that breaking down is also waking up. Breaking down is shifting up in the process of breaking down, we often shift up to a new level of being. So in a sense, as you were suggesting, we don't need to be so afraid of turmoil and trauma, because they can be a source of transformation.
Thank you. I really, that was a beautiful way to wake up. I feel like I went to church.
Great.
Thank you so much for joining me today on The Rose Woman. I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to me at the.rose.woman on Instagram. Please come and visit my company, rosewoman.com, for intimate care and body care products to serve a woman throughout her life cycles from birth to 100 with organic, beautiful, plant-based ingredients. And if you haven't yet, I have a new book that just came out this week called Reverence, Creating Ritual in Daily Life. And if you're enjoying these conversations, maybe you'll also enjoy that book. You can find Reverence at rosewoman.com, or you can find it at Amazon. Thank you, peace, blessings to a world that works for everyone, to your happiness, clarity, and joy.